Welcome to the Connected Ministry series. My name is Nancy Smith, and I'll be your host today. This series is brought to you by Gloo, the trusted platform that connects ministry leaders to resources, people, insights, and funding so your people can flourish and your organization can thrive. Before we get started, go ahead and like this video and subscribe so you never miss an update. If your church is looking to build a more connected ministry, Gloo is here to help. Visit gloo.us to get started with curated resources from partners like Carey Nieuwhof, Barna, and the Worship Initiative. You can also get free texting to engage your church and ready to deploy assessments to better know your people. Get started today at gloo.us. So guys, in this episode, I had the opportunity to sit down with Ed Stetzer, the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology. And what was cool is I really got a chance to know him on a deeper level. As many of you know, Ed is really no stranger to the church. And in this interview, we got to learn Ed's ministry origin story, and it was pretty cool. We also learned how his family plays an important part in his ministry. And then what I found really valuable is he offered sage advice to ministry leaders in areas like, how do you discern your calling as a leader? How do you know when to move on? And how do you navigate today's ever-changing culture? Because let's be honest, it is changing and there's always new challenges. And so here is my conversation with Ed Stetzer, and I really hope you enjoy it.
So my name is Ed Stetzer. I'm the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology. My journey begins in New York City. My parents took me home to a little apartment between a bar and a funeral home in Queens, New York, a floor block on the Queens side. I grew up in a non-Christian home. Through a chain of events, it began with my sister riding a bus to some random church, and then my sister and my mother both becoming Christians. Eventually, one day, my mother punished me by grounding me, and she said I could be grounded for a week or I could go to this youth camp for a week. Camp seemed better than being in my room by myself before video games. And so I went off to this camp, and my life was pretty much a bit of a challenge. We had moved from Florida to New York. Little Eddie Stetzer wasn't getting along with the neighbors because he was far too New Yorker. Well, at that camp, I found a welcoming group of people who shared the gospel with me, and I received by grace and through faith the good news of the gospel, youth group age. Still, most of my family weren't believers, and still to this day aren't believers. So to see that life transformation, I never really got over the fact that I was once dead in my trespasses and sins and made alive in Christ. And so began a journey, started, my first thing was a Bible study at my high school, some over the resistance of some of the administrators, but eventually that was adjudicated. But eventually this young lady came in this cute little softball uniform, and she was just, I remember the dark blue shorts and the light blue shirt, and she came in late, and then she left early, and I said, I need to find out who this girl is. So about a year being friends, I started dating her, and 4 years later, she became my wife, and we were married. From there, we moved off to college to get 1 year apart for college, and then we couldn't stand that, so we came together, and between our junior and senior year, we got married, and don't tell our kids, we don't want them to get married that young. But we were married at 20 years of age, but we've been dating since we were 16. And so we finished college. I was going to college doing an undergraduate degree in biology and chemistry, planning to go to medical school. And then the Lord redirected us just through a very dramatic means. We don't have time to unpack here. And we instead decided to move at 21 years of age to the inner city of Buffalo, New York. We wanted to go to the hardest place to plant a church. It's the fastest shrinking city in America in the middle of the crack epidemic of the late 80s and the early 90s. So we moved to Buffalo. I got a job as a contractor. If you need me to rewire your house or replumb your house, I can do that. And we got a job as a contractor, started knocking on doors, telling people about Jesus, planted a church. On the weekends, realized about a year in, I didn't know what I was doing. I was 21 years of age. No one should have been sent with a biology and chemistry degree, but I was part of a denomination. It was a very low church, and I was ordained by a local church and just went. So I started seminary. I did a couple of seminary degrees while there in Buffalo, and my master's in divinity, eventually finishing a master's of arts. Went down the road, planted another church in a place called Erie, Pennsylvania. That kind of blew up, and it was very successful. People started paying attention. I started writing a church planning newsletter. I worked on a doctor of ministry when I was there. And then I got a phone call one day from a guy named Rick Warren on my cell phone, back when minutes were $1 a minute. He just talks a lot. So he had a long story for me, but he had a vision. They were going to create a church planning center at a seminary, and it was jointly created from that seminary and from Saddleback at that time, Purpose Driven. And so I had just finished my doctor of ministry. The ink was still wet on my DMin, so I moved to seminary. I served there for 3 years as a professor of church planning, but I did a PhD there while I was there in missiology. And from that point, I began to speak and write on it. I served for about 5 or 6 years as the missiologist and director of research at something called the North American Mission Board. Then I went to something called Lifeway, where I led Lifeway research for about a decade. And then lastly, went to Wheaton College, where I served for 7 years leading the Billy Graham Center. Had 3 daughters, 3 amazing daughters along the way and on our journey. And most recently, moved to California to lead the Talbot School of Theology, which is the 5th largest multi-denominational seminary in the world. And just excited seeing what the Lord's doing. So our journey has been filled with steps of faith and obedience to the Lord and surprising twists and turns as we go.
Talk a little bit about discernment. How did you know each time when to go, where to move, like what next steps to take?
I would say discerning the will of God at different times has actually been a different experience for me. So when I was in college, I had gone through the process to get a scholarship from the Army to college and medical school. And I had gone through what's called MEPS, which is Military Entry Processing Station. And so got a nice letter from the Army and was, right at that time, be ROTC. And then after MEPS, it took months for the report to come back from MEPS. That's where you get your physical. I was doing all the stuff you would do to prepare for that. And that's when the major brought me in and said, son, you've got some scar tissue on the back of your left eye that doesn't qualify. You're now disqualified for military service. And I said, but I'm just going to be a doctor. And he said, well, you have difficulty with flashing lights. Like when you drive at night, you have difficulty with flashing lights. I do till this day. Because of the scar tissue in the back of it. From when I was born, they used the salad spoons and ended up with a little scar tissue. Doesn't impact day to day, but it does impact flashing lights at night. And I said, yeah, but I'm just gonna be a doctor. I wanted to be an emergency room doctor. And he said, well, you know what we do in the Army, son? I said, yes, sir, I do. He says, there's a lot of flashing bright lights at night. And so that was really just such a calamitous moment. I mean, Don and I had a path, I had a plan. I went to college to be an emergency room physician. I was going to serve with the Army for some and then go into medical missions. All that collapsed one day, and we really struggled through it. And so we began to pray about what we wanted to do. I looked at being a college minister. I looked at being a youth pastor. I was a youth pastor at the time, a part-time youth pastor in college. I'm not sure that I thought I was the best youth pastor. But so we began to pray, and so through a friend of a friend, I looked into church planning. And through a friend of a friend said, they like to plant a church in Buffalo. My denomination wants to plant a church in Buffalo. So I drove up there, just me. Donna couldn't come that time. She was student teaching. And while we were there, this is very, I was standing at on Prospect Avenue in Buffalo. It's basically downtown Buffalo. And I kind of heard from the Lord. It wasn't an audible voice, but it was a sense I kind of heard from the Lord, come plant my church here. Not my church, but the Lord's church here. And, the Lord just gave me a burden for the people of the city of Buffalo, the forgotten, the left behind. My father, when I told him we were moving to Buffalo, he said, why would you want to go to the armpit of New York? Because it's, it's not a great reputation city. So I called back to Donna, we got on the hotel phone and I said, I really think I have some clarity from the Lord, and came back. And when we came back together, I said, I want you to pray too. And she said, we came back together, and I came back and said, I think the Lord's calling us to plant a church in Buffalo. I don't have any money, there's no job. Later, the mission agency, my denomination, turned me down, which I would have turned me down. I later became the person in charge of turning people down. I just did it more nicely than they did to me. But Donna said, I think we're supposed to go to Buffalo, sight unseen. So much to the horror of our parents. There was a drive-by shooting 2 doors down from us. Buffalo was on the front page of the news every day. But, we just felt very clear sense of the Lord's calling. And then subsequently, when we moved to Erie, we planted a church there called Mill Creek Community Church and planted 2 daughter churches out of that. it wasn't as clear, but it was still clear. So we took a time of prayer and fasting. And just eventually, the thing that nodded us in that direction was, it was like the Lord just burdened us for the people of Erie's, the suburb of Erie is called Mill Creek. And, we went there, and it was sort of this blue-collar, emerging white-collar suburb, but it was this mix. 10% of the molded plastics in the world were made in that corridor. So it was like a lot of people who had been blue-collar people who had done well. I could relate to that context. I grew up in a blue-collar home. There were times we were on public assistance and were struggling. So eventually, in that case, I just kept getting a burden. So I would think about this place, West 38th Street in Sterretania, and I would just see people drive by, and I would say, God wants me to pastor these people and to care for these people. So in that case, our burden grew, and the burden became the call. We felt a sense of release from Buffalo and a call to Erie. And I think that's almost always in most people's thing. There's both a push and a pull. And sometimes it doesn't go well. Like, for example, when I went from that local church that I planted there and I became a professor, we really felt the Lord's call in it, but it didn't end up being a good fit. So it was. I served there 3 years. It was a difficult place. I found it, to be difficult to relate some health issues, and so. But I still think the Lord wanted us to go there. But we still learned a lesson. When we were driving to that place, we had a music, the Disney song, "A Whole New World," and so now we never play that song. Whenever we're going somewhere else, we never turn. The Whole New World turned out to be a really rough new world. So, so that place, we were there 3 years, but the door closed pretty quickly. It just wasn't working. And so I was over church planting at that seminary, but my denomination wanted me to be over church planting for all the seminaries. So it was a good play, but that was a stronger push. I needed to get out of there. It wasn't a healthy environment for me. And yet I stepped to another place. And and at that place, they ended up firing some of the staff and pushing out the president. And so there's a lot of turmoil that's there, but I knew that's where the Lord wanted me to be. So I actually stayed in a difficult and unhealthy environment for a few years. And then, but they kind of changed each one. I would say when I went from there to Lifeway, there's a whole backstory that we don't have time to unpack, but Tom Rainer and I weren't friends. And he talks about this in a podcast once that, we didn't get along at times. And so, but he just really felt the Lord pressing on him to invite me to lead Lifeway Research, because I was leading a research firm at the agency where I was serving. I was director of research. And so he called me up and he said, I know you can hear the Twilight Zone music playing in the background, but we want you to pray about becoming the head of Lifeway Research. And that was one we just had to pray through things. And so you had to press in prayer to get clarity, but it took us a while, but we did. And that turned out to be a wonderful decade, about almost a decade of work. So what I would say is there's a few factors. One is there's often a push. You feel like your work here is done in some way. And then there's often a pull. You feel a burden to do something there. I would say be careful to elevate. Like my first experience in Buffalo was a very dramatic experience of call. I would say that's not been normal in my life, but since it was the first thing that ever happened, and part of the reason I think it's the first thing that ever happened is that I needed something to move to Buffalo, New York, you needed some sort of dramatic, fire by night and cloud by day experience. But mostly it's discerning and conversation with friends and people who care about you and people who know you, your local church affirming that as well. A church was behind me going to Buffalo, 100%. And I would say too, looking for, particularly if you're a pastor and a church leader, has God given you a burden for the people and the place where you're considering going? If God hadn't given you a burden for the people and the place, when the going gets tough, a year or 2 years after the honeymoon's over, you're going to say, man, this was a job. Now I need another job. I never took a job. I always took a call, and it happened to often, sometimes it wasn't a job. In Buffalo, we didn't have any, I worked as a contractor. But I think those are key markers is there a push? Are you finished here? Is there a pull? Do you have a sense of burden for people and place? I would take the time to fast and pray until you have a sense of clarity. I would make sure that the husband and wife are aligned. I would say, too, worth mentioning on that, we were always aligned. I would never do something. I think that Donna has veto power over ministry for me in general, which some people will be offended by. But if my wife says to me, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm pretty much disqualified anyway. And so why not then say, where? So, and I would say too, like right now, if Donna were to say to me, man, this is just killing our family, I need you to step away from blank. I would do that because, I can build houses and I can do management, I can do whatever. But because she has that veto power, just, if you're at odds with your wife, you're not going to thrive in ministry. But I would also say too that Donna is more risk averse. So I love risk. I'm an entrepreneur. Donna's more risk averse. So I would have done things along the way. I mean, people who follow my journey, I've done some risky things, right? So you don't move to the inner city of Buffalo, New York, and the fastest shrinking city in America in the middle of the crack epidemic. But also, I didn't do some other risky things because we needed to come to alignment, and the Lord used that process. Simultaneously, Donna would say that if she just made those decisions, we would be probably in the same place that we were 30 years ago. She loves that longevity. So there's a beauty and intertwining in the marriage relationship for us. But sometimes the more risk-averse person has to say, well, where are you with the Lord on this? And sometimes the less risk-averse person has to say, where are you with the Lord on this? And then we made those decisions together. So it's fascinating to me because I watch some people who have sort of made their decisions on the basis of a career path, kind of like a lawyer saying, well, I want to work I'll work as a clerk and I'll be a junior partner and I'll become a partner. And I just think that that's a really terrible way to go through life in ministry. I mean, I'm not saying if you're a lawyer doing that, if you're, working up, becoming a partner in the firm, in the accounting firm, but going into ministry, basically creating strategic pathways so you can better yourself professionally seems like a really bad idea. We went somewhere no one else wanted to go with no money, turned down to be appointed by the mission agency, and went anyway because that's God's call. Not saying it was without foolishness as a 20-year-old considering this, but I would just say if you put your yes on the table and let God put it on the map and you go in obedience to him, he'll use you in ways you might be surprised he'll use you, and he might also use you in obscurity for 30, 40 years, and praise God for that as well. But you put your yes on the table, let God put it on the map.
Tell us a little bit about you. You just shared some of the accreditations, the learning journey you've been on. Knowledge is a really important part of that. Why is that an important part of what drives you, and how has that helped you in ministry? You personally, not
yeah.
Everybody.
Right, I think that's an important distinction. Yeah, so even as you asked the question, I think it's an important distinction to say that my call may be unique. I happen to have a unique ability to recall facts, figures, things I've read, and a unique ability to synthesize those things in ways that then can be communicated to a popular audience. So one book calls that skill being a maven. So you sort of be able to take things and communicate them to others. And so that's been sort of a lot of my role in evangelicalism, to help people, for example, navigate these challenging times. I think ultimately naming things helps people navigate them. So I've been explaining that we're in the midst of a cultural convulsion that looks like happens every 60 years. I base it on some work of some prior scholars, and typically can last 4 to 6 years. And we're also in the great sort ideologically, where people are sorting themselves in and out of their churches ideologically. So why do people resonate with that? When you name things, people can then understand them and they can navigate them. So that's a big part of what I try to do. But I remember I was in a Q&A once. It was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it was me and Leonard Sweet. It was early on. Leonard Sweet had just written the foreword to my very first book, called Planting New Churches in a Postmodern Age. And the publisher put Len Sweet's name almost bigger than my name on the cover. No one ever heard of me, but everyone heard of Len Sweet at that time, and still today for many. But so we were doing this Q&A, and somebody asked Len Sweet and me. We were both. It was him and me. It wasn't really a panel. I don't know how many you have to have a panel. And Len Sweet said, someone asked him, "What do you do to keep up with the culture?" And it was a super question. I wanted to know the answer. He went through and listed the publications that he reads. And I think he went through about 15 or 16 publications, how he keeps up, because he's always thinking about film and image and semiotics and all sorts of stuff. I told him he's got like 5 movies playing in his head at any given time. And so I listened to the answer. Now I was young, and I was probably more brash than I needed to be. And I said, and so what about you, Ed? I said, well, it's not dissimilar to Leonard Sweet, but I want to say to you, that's not what you should do. So if you're asking Leonard Sweet and me what you should do to keep up with the culture, and we're engaging sort of the raw culture and then filtering it through. So I subscribe to about a dozen print magazines. So I'll be reading The Atlantic, I'm reading Time, reading US News World Report, I'm reading whatever newspapers, I'm reading New York Times, whatever. And Christian publications, Christianity Today and World and all the wonderful stuff, and Outreach should I add as well, and church leaders. But my job is to keep up with those things. So people say to me, pastors will say to me, So how do you keep up with all this stuff? And he said, well, that's my job. I said, I bet you know the name of the woman who just had the baby, who's had some health issues. I bet you know the name of the older man who's been losing his memory. I bet you know. So I can tell you what's going on in Donetsk in Ukraine because we have a center at the Talbot School of Theology in Kyiv. So that's my job to know those things. Your job as a pastor. So then how do you keep up? Well, you probably will find some people that you listen to who are maven-like individuals who are sort of listening to the cultural moment and helping you to think through that. And there's some podcasts that think about it. This is one of the reasons I think podcasts have become so helpful, is they become lenses through which people can view the broader culture. Now, what I would say is just make sure your lens isn't distorted. If your way of viewing the world is through the lens of cable news, we know that's being distorted because we actually know that they know that if you create things that make people angry or fearful, they'll come back. So the algorithm on your social media, please don't be, and far too many Christians are being discipled by their cable news choices and spiritually shaped by their social media, both of which are weaponized against thoughtful engagement. So find something, someone, some resources. And again, I think more and more people are going to podcasts to sort of examine the cultural news. Make sure that it's going to be, fact-based and thoughtful. And I would say, too, with a Christian worldview, though I listen to some that don't, because I want to kind of hear people's different perspective. So what I would say, for most people, what they need is 2 or 3 trusted voices that can help them interpret the cultural moment. And when things come to flare up or come up, they can say, let me learn more about that. So I think for me, I try to keep up with a lot. And now that I'm a Talbot, Talbot's this very large, it's got a large seminary, very large undergrad program. And right now I'm trying to slot and balance a bunch of new responsibilities. When I was at Wheaton, I had sort of built around that, we have time to do this and this and this. So I'm 5 years late on a book contract to InterVarsity Press on the current state and future of evangelicalism. But when that comes out, people might say that's helpful. I can read that and get a picture of where things are. Whereas instead of reading, I'm engaging 200 to 300 books, articles, journals, interviews, which may be just overwhelming for somebody along the way. So what I would say is, I think you can be well-informed without being a scholar and a missiologist. The way I say it sometimes is, because I'm a missiologist, I'm a classically trained missiologist, PhD in the subject, is that not everyone should be a missiologist, but everybody can live like a missionary, knowing their community, having the tools to engage their community, and people, missiologists, but all kinds of other things, right? Cultural commentators, they can help you to engage the cultural moment.
Talk about a time in your life when you got stuck and how you overcame that. So the burden was there, but you were in a situation where maybe it was difficult. It's like, what was even your process for moving through versus leaving?
Yeah. Well, I often find myself stuck. I think that, and there's a lot of different ways you do that. Sometimes you get stuck organizationally, and typically in a situation like that, there's some sort of log jam that actually needs to be broken. And so in a situation where an organization is stuck, sometimes you have to push, you have to break the log jam. It's a little bit of chaos. You got to go through the tunnel of chaos to get out the other side. And that's organizationally. And I would say too, when stuff like that, when it's an organizational situation, the only way out is through. So you got to walk through that. And I think a lot of people, a lot of leaders are, they're conflict averse, particularly pastors went into ministry because they wanted to love people. They wanted to pastor people. And I think I want more of that, not less. And so pastors need to be concerned about conflict because conflict has a significant impact, particularly church conflict has a significant impact on people's soul and heart and mind. So I think we need to be careful with that. But at the same time, leaders lean into the hard moments, and that's what makes them leaders. I had a conversation recently with one of my staff, one of my direct reports, and she said, "I feel like I only bring you problems." And I said, I quoted Colin Powell, who once said, that's kind of the job, right? You're handling everything that's not a problem, so you should pretty much only bring me problems. He talked about how your soldiers, your chain of command should handle everything they can handle, and the only reason they're going to talk to you is, I can't handle this one, I need your help. Now, if you're in a supervisory relationship, bring some happy news to your boss as well. But I get that, so they need me at that point. But part of what has happened in a lot of churches, organizations, ministries, is people are afraid to lean into the conflict. And I think there's you have to have a capacity for pain, and it's gotten more painful to be a leader this year than last year, and more last year than the year before. And I think maybe in some ways, I planted my first church in late 80s, and it was kind of a golden time. Like historically over 2,000 years, it was kind of unusual that the church had a generally positive reputation. People were, like open maybe to a newfangled church, to use language that would have been big in the 80s and 90s. And I think that you can, maybe a lot of pastors, maybe a little younger than me and older than me, kind of like, well, why is it so much harder now? Well, it's actually been harder in most places, most time for 2,000 years. So I think leaning into that is a key part of kind of addressing those things organizationally. And when you get stuck, part of it is, I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a Christian organization, and it's unhealthy because people refuse to speak to the unhealthy structures that are there. I wrote a 4-part series called Surviving Unhealthy Christian Organizations. It's become one of the most widely read series I've ever did. So I think to acknowledge the unhealth and to lean into the unhealth is hard, hurts sometimes, but it's part of how, when you get stuck, you address organizationally. Personally, when I've felt stuck, has often had to do with I've gotten myself into, because this is just my personality, I've got myself into doing too many things and I'm not doing them all well. And so for me, I actually have a once a month sort of self-check. So I don't do that as much as I used to do, but I have a once a month self-check saying, all right, am I at a sustainable pace? Can I keep doing these things? People often say to me, Ed, how do you do all those things? And the answer is I don't. It's a bit of, I'm the editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine, but the team of Outreach Magazine does the work at Outreach Magazine. So I have a meeting with them. We talk about it. They bring some concerns to me, ideas to me. They're mostly their ideas that I say thumbs up, thumbs down, hardly ever say thumbs down. And they do that. At Talbot, I have, 70 faculty, not counting amazing staff, lots of staff and lots of teams. And yet I have, deans. I'm the dean, but I have 2 other deans and 3 other associate deans, and they do great work. So for me, that's part of it. Now, where I get personally stuck is when I don't have the ability to think about what's next because I'm trying to deal with what's now. So my job as a leader, I'm not the manager. Now, again, I think managers are super important. I hire managers and I love managers. I stand near managers and say, thank you, thank you, thank you. But my job as a leader is to be asking what's next, not what do I got to fix now. And that goes in seasons. Don't misunderstand. Like right now, I'm fixing some things. I'm new at the Talbot School of Theology. I'm fixing some things. But I get stuck when I can't see what's next in the future, because that's part of why organizations that partner with me or hire me, what they want me to do. I get stuck when my personal life isn't aligning well. I didn't know this when I first started these little kids, and they were like so awesome. But having 3 daughters is the greatest joy of my life, and some of the most challenging moments of my life have to do with parenting. And I get stuck then, and I got to say, all right, Lord, help me get through that. So I think it's multifaceted. I think getting unstuck, to use the title of a book, getting unstuck is a real essential skill that all of us need to learn. And probably the reason we stay stuck is we don't want to go through the pain of getting unstuck. I called it like breaking a log jam, right, organizationally. But you have to. And people say, well, this is here. So all the logs are sort of pinned against each other and can't move because they're pinned against each other. And people say, well, if we move that log, it's all going to go downstream. Yeah, but you got to go through the chaos to get out to the other side, to a better place of functioning. And so sometimes you have to dismantle some things to build something better. And I think that's true personally, that's true organizationally.
What is burdening you right now? When you look around, especially with wisdom and experience that you had, what you're seeing, what's burdening you?
Yeah, I think the burden right now is how are Christians going to walk through the cultural moment that we're in? And I think we're not doing well. I think far too many have been caught up in ideology rather than theology and Christian worldview. I don't understand those things have relation to each other, but we can see what it looks like when somebody gets kind of swept up, like in Paul writes in Galatians, almost like they've been bewitched. And I think that's become influential in the church space, ironically, both on the left and the right. So my burden right now is, what's it look like to resist empire, to use the kind of the New Testament term, right? An empire is more than one. You got the entire secular world sort of pulling people away from biblical teaching, trying to marginalize those who have biblical teaching and more. And what's it look like to say, I'm going to believe unpopular things as a follower of Jesus in the 2020s and beyond, into the 2030s, and it might get harder to do that. So I think that's where we need to build in people a Christian understanding, a robust discipleship, a Christian understanding of the world, because we're facing headwinds and challenges from a world that has become much more progressive and no longer sees us. And this is decades in the making, but we don't have home field advantage anymore. And people increasingly are like, well, who are these Christians and why are they a problem? So I think there's that. And so we have to build up my burden is to help build that up so they're ready to face the cultural moment that's there. Simultaneously, I think we have to resist the empire that's actually drawing some Christians towards power and political idolatry and more. And I've written on that, and I by and large, I don't think evangelicals have listened much to me on some of those things. And so as I've thought about, what from here, I think ultimately it means, part of it has to do with ecclesiology. It means what kinds of churches are we going to build that actually stay rooted deeply in the scriptures, resist the world pushing towards more progressive ideas, so Christians will move away from their outdated and ideas. And how do we, from the world as well, saying, well, the answer is to pursue power at all costs and to put, and nobody who does that thinks they're doing that. Nobody who become politically idolatrous thinks they're politically idolatrous. But when that becomes such a focus, and so I think ultimately the best kind of resistance to the pull of the world, you might say simply on the left and the right, is a community of believers who hold one another accountable, who hold biblical views, but do so with some of people of different backgrounds and different mindsets who may even have different ideas how best to engage the cultural moment. But they built this community. This is why I think ecclesiology matters more now than it ever has before. We need the church, and we need the church to, at Mariners Church, we have series of values, and one of them, the source of our unity gets the spotlight. So what is the value that we're going to say the source of our unity gets the spotlight? And for me, I have this whole seminar I'm doing right now where I walk through the cultural moment. I kind of very descriptive of the moment. And then I said, there's actually two things I think are the future. And it's always, people are always a little surprised. I said, you got to elevate your ecclesiology and you got to engage the mission. So I think you elevate your ecclesiology by creating a community that can resist these overwhelming cultural forces pulling us out of community with other Christians who may differ with us on some things, but love the Word of God, love the Scriptures, have been born again and filled with the Holy Spirit. So part of it, so what then, and that's elevate your ecclesiology. And then to engage the mission, I need to help Christians focus on the right thing. I look on social media, some Christians have a mission to tear down other Christians. I look on some social media, some Christians have a mission to just every day say things about their neighbors who must be foolish because they believe something else. And I would say if you elevate your ecclesiology and build that robust community, and you engage the mission and let the source of our unity get the spotlight, which is engaging the mission together, I think ultimately the church will be in a healthier place than if we chase some of these other rabbit trails. And I would say too, it's impacted the way I do ministry. I used to write a lot more articles in the political space, and still can and do. I try to call out some egregious things. I try to call balls and strikes. I try to speak to, I guess I'm one of the few Christians who's defended biblical ethics in the pages of USA Today or spoken up on life in USA Today and CNN. But I've also called out, when we speak dismissively and dehumanizing ways of refugees and immigrants. So I want to call balls and strikes. But at the end of the day, I think for me and for a whole lot of Christians, I'm just seeing that the way we're going to resist the pull of the world, whatever its ideological source, is to build robust communities of Christians who are in deep relationship with one another. That's elevating your ecclesiology, and who have joined Jesus on mission in the world to make a gospel difference. That's ultimately engaging the mission.
That sounds like your vision for the church.
I think it would fit. That would be my vision I'm a church person. I think, I think politics is downstream from culture. And if you want to change politics, if you're disappointed in who people are voting for, and it's quite easy to be in this current cycle, I think ultimately, for me, I want to see lives change in churches, and I think that'll shape people to think differently about politics. At the same time, if current trends continue, we'll continue to be less prevalent in society. We all see the trends. It's declining by 1% a year, just so those who identify as Christian. But I think ultimately building robust communities that can face the cultural pull from left, right, and everywhere else that's not driven by the Word of God is an essential thing for us to do.
Amidst all of that, how can leaders, maybe if you can draw from your own practices, how can leaders stay strong? Mm-hmm. How can they care for themselves? How can they keep their minds, their hearts, their spirits strong in the midst of so much pushing?
Yeah. It's a hard time to be a leader. Probably the hardest time in my lifetime for leaders. And I hear that from other people, not just, I write on a national stage, so I get critiqued and criticized, and I'm fine with that. It's part of life. But I think what a lot of pastors are finding is people are just unhappy in ways that they weren't before. More so in the past, and occasionally still today, I do church revitalization seminars because I love the local church. Ephesians 3:10 said God has chosen the church to make known his manifold wisdom. So I would teach these revitalization pastors, and I would say, if 10% of your church isn't mad at you, you're probably not doing anything significant. And they'd all kind of laugh nervously because if you're doing church revitalization, 10% should probably going to be unhappy with you. And then I would go on and say, now, but if 70% is mad at you, you probably need to slow down. You need to bring people along. And I would say now, just the background dissatisfaction with pastors is probably substantially higher than that for even without doing anything. So if you're speaking prophetically about some of the broken issues in our day, you're going to find that people are unhappy with you. And so what I would say is part of it is get used to it. I don't want to say that in a harsh way. And I think a lot of us have, I think from 2020 forward, people didn't come into 2020 ready for that. And they have started to and need to continue to pay attention to building reservoirs of resilience in their own lives through spiritual practices and more so that they're ready to receive that. If receiving criticism or conflict is just destabilizing for you, there are books and resources, and it might even be counseling to help you be able to do this. Leading a church today is a conflicted enterprise, and you're just going to have to find ways to have reservoirs of resilience to make that. And the other thing too is I would say communities of support. I often say reservoirs of resilience and communities of support can get you through the tumult and the turbulence of this time, because pastors and church staff shouldn't go it alone. Now, if you have a really healthy church and you have a great, whatever your church calls your board, vestry or elders or deacons in some cases. You could be in this together. You need a band of people who are with you and for you, who can also speak honestly to you about what's going well. But you probably also need some reservoirs of support outside. And with the collapse of denominationalism, 50 years ago, someone was in crisis, they'd call their presbytery who would help them. And so now you're going to have to find ways to find people, and it might actually be a coach that you're paying. And because with the collapse of denominationalism, not that it doesn't cease to exist, don't misunderstand. I'm pro denominations, but most pastors now have a loose, particularly the ones in church planning realms and things like that. They have a loose or even a non-existent connection to denomination. So who do they go to? Well, you might have to pay for someone. You say, why should I pay for it? Well, back when you were a Wesleyan and you were giving money to the denomination, they had someone to help because you were helping to support that. So you might have to do that. But also too, networks can become that, is find some people who are going to, that you can have conversations. There are people that, when I'm a local church pastor, I don't want to share everything with local. So I got to vent to somebody who's outside. It might be a local community group of pastors. And I'm not talking about and I'm not against that. I'm not talking about the ministerial association in a town. That's great. You have a breakfast, you kind of share some ideas, but you need 2 or 3 people who are on a journey with you and really are going to be there for you. And, someone who, I was talking to a friend recently and said, we were talking about friends, a level of friends. And this person was like, if you text me, I'll try to get back to you sometime soon. And then this person was, if you call at 3 a.m., I'll answer and say, what do you need? I'm getting in my car. So, so there's different, you need some people who are going to be call at 3 a.m. and say, what do you need? I'm getting in my car. And I would say most pastors don't have that, and they particularly don't have that outside the local church. I think they need both. So I think we can, one of the things we know about difficult times is difficult times produce spiritual kind of ferment. It's sort of there's a churning, maybe better, there's a spiritual churning that's there. And I think that in the past, the Lord has used these moments to bring about spiritual awakenings. The Jesus People movement came out of the last cultural convulsion we had in the late 60s. Before that, if you go back to the early part of the last century, the Welsh revival, and then the Pentecostal movement, they all come in the midst of some real, there's a financial crisis, banking crisis, cultural crisis in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So you see patterns. So I think ultimately that if we help pastors and church leaders thrive in the tumult, in the turbulence, that actually might be a marker people might see and say there's something different about them, and I want to know more about that. So I think there's ironically a gospel opportunity in walking faithfully and with peace that passes all understanding in the midst of a tumultuous moment.
Indeed, helping church leaders thrive so that they can lead thriving organizations and help their people flourish. That's what we do at Gloo, and we're here for you. We want to thank Ed for joining us and for sharing his wisdom, his encouragement, his authenticity in this episode of the Connected Ministry series. It was so much fun to talk with him. You can learn more about Ed at edstetzer.com and get more content from Ed in the Ed Stetzer Hub that's actually on Gloo. There, you're going to find an exclusive offer from Ed Stetzer and Kevin Palau, and it's called Engaging Culture, an Evangelism Masterclass. Guys, this is a super cool offering. It's 8 sessions with friends of Ed and Kevin's. These are teachers and thought leaders, people like Christine Kane, J.D. Greer, Lisa Fields, and more. And they're all coming together to help you revitalize your evangelism efforts. So go check it out. Thanks for watching the Connected Ministry series. We'll see you next time.